"He's still alive," the little beggar girl shouted, brandishing an axe to pry open the closed casket at the millionaire's son's wake. Then the millionaire asked them to let her open the casket, and when they opened it, they discovered something incredible. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The organ music reverberated through the walls of the century-old church as the guests settled into the polished wooden pews. The 30-year-old entrepreneur adjusted his tie for the 5th time that morning, trying to control the anxiety tightening his chest. He had built a financial empire in recent years, amassing wealth through risky ventures and calculated decisions, but none of that had prepared him for this moment. His fortune in Wall Street stocks guaranteed a life of luxury, but it couldn't buy the peace he so desperately sought in this marriage. The bride appeared at the back of the church, a vision of elegance in her white dress that cost the equivalent of 6 months' salary for an average family. She walked slowly down the aisle, her face hidden by the delicate veil, and the guests sighed in admiration. The entrepreneur felt his heart race, but there was something in her steps that seemed hesitant, as if each movement was an internal battle. The Reverend began the ceremony with the traditional words, his solemn voice filling the respectful silence. The vows were exchanged, the rings prepared, and everything seemed to follow the perfect script of a fairy tale wedding. But then, just as the Reverend was about to pronounce the final words, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the aisle. A 4-year-old girl came running between the pews, her bare and dirty feet contrasting with the gleaming floor of the church. Her clothes were poorly stitched rags, her face marked by hunger and days spent sleeping in the open. She was so small and thin that many guests initially thought she was a lost 2-year-old. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't her miserable appearance, but the desperate cry that came from her throat. "She's lying! She's lying to everyone!" The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes turned to the small figure who continued advancing down the aisle, her dirty hands pointing directly at the bride. The entrepreneur stood paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. The bride took a step back, the bouquet of flowers falling from her trembling hands. Before anyone could react, the girl reached the bride and, with surprising strength for someone so fragile, grabbed the fabric of the white dress and pulled with all her might. The dress tore partially in the back, exposing the woman's fair skin. And that's when everyone saw it. Tattoos, marks, complex symbols that ran across the bride's back like a map of buried secrets. Some were numbers, others looked like codes, and there were drawings that resembled official documents. The entrepreneur felt his blood run cold when he recognized some of those symbols. He had seen them years ago in papers related to a fraud scheme that had destroyed a considerable part of his family's business, taking away investments and leaving financial scars that took years to heal. The guests erupted in shocked murmurs. The bride let out a cry of humiliation and despair, her hands trying to cover her exposed back as tears ran down her face. She looked at the groom once, her eyes conveying a mixture of shame and terror, before running down the side aisle and disappearing through the back of the church. The sound of her heels against the stone floor echoed until it faded completely. The entrepreneur remained motionless at the altar, unable to form coherent thoughts. The girl who had destroyed his wedding in a matter of seconds had also disappeared into the confusion of the guests who were getting up, arguing, and trying to understand what they had just witnessed. When he finally managed to move, he ran to the back door, but both the bride and the child had vanished without a trace. The following weeks were a blur of cancellations, embarrassing conversations, and sleepless nights. The entrepreneur became obsessed with 2 questions that kept him awake. Where was the woman he was going to marry, and who was that dirty, hungry girl who knew such deep secrets about his past? He hired private investigators, spent a considerable part of his fortune on searches that led nowhere, and with each passing day, the frustration and confusion only grew. His family did not understand the obsession. For them, the important thing was that the marriage had not been consummated, that he had escaped a woman with a clearly problematic past. But the entrepreneur couldn't simply move on. Those symbols on the bride's back represented more than old frauds. They represented a connection to events that had changed the course of his life, that had forced his late father to sell assets and reduce the family's capital to cover losses. 2 months dragged on without answers. The entrepreneur began to frequent areas he had never set foot in before, poor neighborhoods of the large metropolis where his drivers refused to enter with the luxury cars. He walked on foot, observing the streets, looking for a small face that could be on any corner. It was on a rainy afternoon, when he was about to give up once again, that he saw her. The girl was sitting in a cardboard box under a broken marquee, trying to protect herself from the rain that was starting to fall. Next to her, an older woman was coughing violently, her thin body trembling with each spasm. The entrepreneur approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, not knowing exactly what he would say when she recognized him. The girl looked up and stared at him for a long moment. There was no fear in her eyes, only a resignation too heavy for someone so young. The older woman tried to get up, protective, but she didn't have the strength. And it was there, on that wet sidewalk on the outskirts of the city, that the entrepreneur understood that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined on that interrupted wedding morning. The rain fell harder as the entrepreneur crouched down to be at the girl's height. The older woman tried to position herself between him and the child, her eyes suspicious, despite the obvious weakness in her sick body. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, trying to show that he posed no danger. "I just want to talk," he said, his voice almost lost in the noise of the water hitting the asphalt. "I need to understand what happened that day at the church." The girl tilted her head, studying him with an intensity disturbing for someone so young. "You were going to marry the bad lady," she replied with her thin voice. "But she's not really bad. She just does bad things because someone tells her to." The entrepreneur felt a shiver run down his spine. "How do you know that? Who told you about her?" "She did," the girl replied simply. "She used to come here. She brought bread, sometimes hot soup, and she cried a lot, always crying and saying things I didn't quite understand." The older woman intervened, her voice hoarse from illness. "The pretty lady did come. Every week. Sometimes twice. Always hidden, always looking around like someone was following her. She brought food, medicine when I coughed a lot. But she also said strange things about debts and regrets." The entrepreneur processed this information, feeling the pieces of a complex puzzle begin to fit together crookedly. "And the marks on her back? How did you know about that?" The girl pulled her wet shirt up, revealing a thin shoulder. "She showed me once. She said they were bad things that made her do. That had numbers of important papers, things that hurt good people." The child pointed to the sick woman. "People like Grandma who takes care of me." It was at that moment that the entrepreneur realized the depth of the situation. That fragile and sick woman, that abandoned girl sleeping in cardboard boxes, were collateral victims of the same scheme that had harmed his own family. And somehow, the woman he was going to marry was connected to all of this. "Tell me more," he asked, sitting on the wet sidewalk without caring about the expensive suit he was wearing. "Everything you remember her saying." For the next hour, as the rain slowly subsided, the girl told in simple and confusing words about the bride's visits. She talked about how the elegant woman always arrived by taxi, never in her own car, and how she constantly looked over her shoulder. How she brought money sometimes, but always in small amounts, as if she was afraid someone would notice large withdrawals. How she hugged the girl and cried, saying she was trying to do something right after so many wrong things. The entrepreneur listened to every word, his business mind trying to organize fragmented information into a coherent picture. When the girl finished, he looked at the sick woman, who was now lying in the cardboard box, exhausted from coughing. "She needs a doctor," he said, "and you two need a place to stay that isn't the street." The older woman stared at him suspiciously. "And what do you want in return? Rich men don't do anything for free. I want you to help me find the woman who used to come here, and I want to understand the whole story behind those marks." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But regardless of that, you two can't keep living like this. I know a place, a small apartment that I have but don't use. I can guarantee you have a roof, food, and medical treatment." The proposal was met with silence. The girl looked at her caregiver, waiting for guidance. The sick woman closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. "And if we tell you everything, and you decide it's not worth helping anymore, we go back here?" "No," the entrepreneur promised, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "You won't go back. I guarantee that." In the following days, he kept his word. The apartment was simple, located in a modest but safe neighborhood, far from the social circles where he moved. He furnished the space with the basic necessities and ensured that the older woman received adequate medical care. The doctors confirmed what he already suspected. She was seriously ill, and the time living on the streets had accelerated the progression of her condition. The girl adapted to the new space with a mixture of enchantment and suspicion. She explored each room as if it were a palace, but always kept a small backpack near her, ready to run away at any moment. The entrepreneur visited daily, bringing food and sitting down to hear more stories about the bride's visits. It was in one of these conversations that the sick woman, during a moment of lucidity between the medications, revealed something that would change everything. "The pretty lady wasn't the villain," she said, her voice weak but firm. "She told me once, when she was particularly bad. She said she had a brother, a cruel man, who forced her to do terrible things, that he knew secrets about her family, things that could destroy her mother, and he used that to control her." The entrepreneur leaned forward, every muscle tense. What kind of things did he force her to do? Sign papers, forge documents, use her beauty to get information from businessmen. The woman coughed violently before continuing. "She said that when she met you, she saw a chance to escape. She thought that if she married someone powerful, with resources and influence, her brother couldn't touch her anymore." The revelation fell on the entrepreneur like a bucket of cold water. He had assumed that the bride was a criminal, a con artist who had tried to deceive him to gain access to his fortune. But if that woman was telling the truth, then the situation was much more complex. His ex-fiancée wasn't a villain seeking easy wealth, but a desperate victim seeking protection. "Why didn't she tell me?" he murmured, more to himself than to the sick woman. "Because men like you don't believe in stories like that," the woman replied with brutal honesty. "You see a beautiful woman with a dark past and assume the worst, and she knew that. She knew that if she told you, you would think it was a lie to manipulate you." The girl, who was drawing on the floor with colored chalk that the entrepreneur had bought, interrupted the conversation. "The bad man really exists," she said, without looking up from the drawing. "The pretty lady talked about him once. She said he had cold eyes, and that he hit her when she was little. She said she was afraid he would find where she was." The entrepreneur felt a fury grow in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. His entire life had been built on logic, financial calculations, and rational decisions. But now, sitting in that simple apartment, listening to a 4-year-old child describe abuse and manipulation, he felt something more primal taking over. The need to protect, to do justice, to correct the mistake he had made in judging the woman he loved without knowing the whole story. "I need to find her," he said, standing up with renewed determination. "I need to tell her that I understand now, that I want to help." The sick woman held his wrist with surprising strength. "Be careful. If her brother finds out that you're looking, he could use that against her or against you." But the entrepreneur had already made his decision. In the following days, he redoubled his search efforts, this time with new information and a different understanding of what he was looking for. No longer a guilty fugitive, but a hidden victim, probably working in humble jobs, trying to survive away from the control of the one who had manipulated her for so long. And while searching, he continued to visit the girl and her caregiver, creating a bond that he had not foreseen. The child began to call him Rich Uncle, a nickname that made him smile despite the seriousness of the situation. She told stories about her life on the streets, about the dreams she had before falling asleep in the cardboard boxes, about the hope of one day having a real family. It was during one of these conversations that the sick woman had a particularly severe crisis. The entrepreneur rushed her to the hospital, the girl clinging to his hand with desperate force. The doctors were clear. Time was running out quickly. The illness had progressed too far, and the years of medical neglect were taking their final toll. That night, while the woman slept under sedation and the girl dozed in a chair next to the hospital bed, the entrepreneur stared out the hospital room window, watching the city lights stretch to the horizon. His investment portfolio could buy almost anything, but it couldn't buy more time for that woman who had dedicated her last years to caring for an abandoned child. And somewhere in that same city, the woman he had loved was alone, hidden, probably still running from the brother who controlled her. The entrepreneur clenched his fists, making a silent promise. He would find his ex-fiancée, protect the girl, and make whoever was responsible for so much suffering pay for every tear shed. The sick woman passed away on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the interrupted wedding. The entrepreneur was present when the monitors started beeping, when the doctors rushed to try to reverse the inevitable, and when they finally declared that there was nothing more to be done. The girl was sleeping in his lap at that moment, exhausted after 3 days practically without leaving the hospital. He didn't know how to tell her, how to explain to a 4-year-old child that the only person who really loved her, who had found her abandoned and chose to take care of her even without resources, had left forever. When the girl woke up and saw the white sheets covering the body, she didn't cry. She simply stared, her eyes big and empty, as if a part of her had shut down along with that last breath. The following days were the most difficult the entrepreneur had ever faced. The girl refused to talk, to eat, to get out of bed. She just huddled under the covers in the apartment he had provided, making herself as small as possible, as if she wanted to disappear completely. He tried everything. He brought foods she liked, colorful toys, books with beautiful illustrations. Nothing worked. It was his secretary who suggested calling a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. The professional, a middle-aged woman with a soft voice and infinite patience, began to visit the girl daily. Progress was painfully slow. Some days the child didn't even recognize the therapist's presence. Other days, she would explode in fits of rage, throwing objects and screaming that she wanted her grandma back. The entrepreneur found himself torn between his business, which was beginning to suffer from his constant absence, and that child who had become his responsibility without him really planning it. His family pressured him to put the girl in some specialized institution, arguing that a single man was not able to raise a traumatized child alone. "You have a company to run," his mother said during weekly calls. "You have responsibilities. That child needs professionals, not someone who is just trying to alleviate his own guilt." The words hurt because they contained a grain of truth. Was he trying to alleviate his guilt? Guilt for not paying attention to the signs about the bride? Guilt for having lived his entire life focused only on accumulating capital and investments, while people suffered just blocks away? Or was there something more? A genuine connection with that girl who had destroyed his wedding but perhaps saved his soul? While dealing with these questions, the search for his ex-fiancée finally yielded results. One of the private investigators he had hired located her working as a janitor in a public hospital on the other side of town. The entrepreneur couldn't believe it when he saw the photos. The woman who used to wear designer dresses and expensive jewelry now wore a simple light blue uniform, her hair tied in a tight bun, scrubbing floors and cleaning bathrooms. He went there on a Thursday afternoon, his heart pounding as he watched her from afar. She looked thinner, with deep circles under her eyes marking her face. But there was still that beauty that had initially attracted him. He waited until her break to approach her, finding her sitting alone in the hospital's outdoor area, eating a simple sandwich. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down next to her without asking permission. The woman almost choked on her food, her eyes widening in panic. She looked around quickly, as if checking if anyone was watching, and then tried to get up. He held her wrist gently. "Please, I know about your brother. I know you were forced to do those things. I just want to help." She froze, tears immediately welling up in her eyes. "You don't understand anything," she whispered, her voice broken. "If he finds out that you found me, that you're trying to help me, he'll use that. He'll hurt you, your family, anyone close to you." "Let me worry about that," the entrepreneur replied, surprising himself with his own courage. "I have resources, I have lawyers. I can protect you. Nobody can protect me from him," she said, pulling her arm away and moving back. "You should have stayed away. You should have moved on with your life and forgotten about me." But before she could leave, he mentioned the girl. He spoke about how he had found her, about the woman who cared for her and who had passed away, about the devastated state in which the child found herself. And it was when he mentioned the girl that he saw the ex-fiancé's expression change completely. "Is she okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "The little one from the outskirts?" "No, she's not okay. She's broken, traumatized, and I don't know how to help her." He paused. "But she talks about you. She says you were kind, that you brought food and comfort." The ex-fiancée covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. "I tried to do at least one thing right. After everything I was forced to do, all the people I hurt, I thought that maybe I could save at least one life." They talked for almost an hour, her telling fragments of her story between tears, about how her brother had manipulated her since she was young, using guilt over her parents' separation as a tool of control, about how she was forced to participate in document forgeries, to use her appearance to get information from unsuspecting businessmen, about how every time she tried to rebel, he threatened to expose secrets that would destroy not only her, but her entire family. "When I met you, I saw a way out," she confessed. "I thought that if I married someone powerful, with enough connections and wealth to face him, I would finally be safe. But it was selfish. I was using you as much as my brother was using me." The entrepreneur processed that in silence. Part of him wanted to be angry, to feel manipulated. But looking at that broken woman, working in a humiliating job to survive, still paying debts that her brother had created with local loan sharks, he only felt compassion. "Let me help for real," he insisted. "I have lawyers who can sue your brother, who can gather evidence and report him. You don't have to live on the run forever." "You don't understand the kind of person he is," she replied, wiping away her tears. "He's not just a common criminal. He has connections, people who owe him favors. If I testify against him, if I try to expose him, he will destroy everything and everyone I love." But the entrepreneur didn't give up. In the following days, he began to work discreetly with his lawyers, gathering information about the ex-fiancé's brother. He discovered a trail of fraud, forgery, and victims that stretched back years. And slowly, he began to build a case that could finally free that woman from his destructive control. Meanwhile, the girl was beginning to show small signs of improvement with therapy. She started talking again, albeit in short sentences. She started drawing again, creating images of birds and trees that the therapist said were symbols of freedom and growth. But the nightmares continued, and there were times when she completely regressed, hiding under the bed and refusing to come out. It was during one of these crises that the entrepreneur had an idea. He took the girl to the hospital where the ex-fiancé worked, waiting in the parking lot until the end of her shift. When the woman came out, exhausted after 12 hours of work, she found the two waiting. The girl recognized her immediately. Her eyes lit up in a way that the entrepreneur hadn't seen in weeks. "Pretty lady," she shouted, running towards the woman. The ex-fiancé fell to her knees and hugged the child, tears running freely down her face. "My little one, you're so big, so beautiful." "Grandma's gone," the girl said, with that brutal honesty of children. "She doesn't wake up anymore." "I know, honey. I know, and I'm so sorry." The entrepreneur observed the encounter from a distance, realizing something that should have been obvious from the start. Those two shared a similar pain, an understanding of suffering that he, with all his wealth and privilege, could never truly understand. They were survivors, fighting against a world that seemed determined to break them. But then the girl did something unexpected. She moved away from the ex-fiancé and asked, with her childish voice, "Was it you who made Grandma sick? The uncle said that the bad things you did hurt a lot of people." The silence that followed was heavy. The ex-fiancé looked at the entrepreneur with an expression of betrayal and then back at the girl. "Not directly," she replied, choosing to be honest. "But yes, the things I was forced to do hurt good people. And I carry that guilt every day." The girl stared at her for a long moment, processing the information with her 4-year-old mind. Then, without saying anything else, she returned to the entrepreneur and took his hand, creating a physical and emotional distance from the woman who had once comforted her. The ex-fiancé stood up slowly, the pain evident in every movement. "She's right to blame me," she said, looking at the entrepreneur. "And so should you. It doesn't matter that I was forced. In the end, I made choices, and those choices hurt innocent people." She turned to leave, but the entrepreneur's voice stopped her. "That doesn't mean you don't deserve a second chance. It doesn't mean you need to carry this alone forever." But at that moment, with the girl clinging to his leg and the ex-fiancé walking away into the night, he realized that the situation was much more complicated than simply helping a victim. There were layers of pain, guilt, and consequences that couldn't be solved with money or goodwill. And for the first time in his life, the entrepreneur found himself completely lost, not knowing what was the right path to take. The following months tested the emotional endurance of everyone involved in ways that no one could have predicted. The entrepreneur formalized the girl's guardianship, facing a devastating legal battle when his own family challenged the decision. They argued that a single man, focused on managing a financial empire, was not able to raise a traumatized child. Each hearing exposed his past mistakes, his emotional coldness, his years of voluntary isolation. The girl, enrolled in an expensive private school, suffered daily from the prejudice of other children who discovered her background. They called her trash girl, refused to play with her, and some parents even complained to the principal about allowing someone of that kind to study there. She came home every day with red eyes, but refused to cry in front of the entrepreneur, saving her tears for when she was alone in her room. The behavioral problems intensified. She had outbursts of rage without warning, threw objects, screamed that she wanted her grandma back. Other times, she was completely apathetic, sitting in the corner staring at nothing for hours. The therapist explained that these were normal manifestations of a complicated grief due to trauma, but that didn't make it any easier for the entrepreneur to deal with the situation. Meanwhile, the ex-fiancé continued working at the hospital, keeping her distance but always asking about the girl when she crossed paths with the entrepreneur during his visits to the lawyers he had hired to file a lawsuit against her brother. She had initially refused help, but the pressure from the loan sharks and the constant threats from her brother finally forced her to accept it. The lawsuit against her brother was slow and bureaucratic. He had connections that hindered every step, lawyers who delayed hearings, witnesses who changed their statements. But the entrepreneur was persistent, using a considerable part of his assets to hire the best professionals, gather irrefutable evidence, build a solid case. It was during one of these hearings that the ex-fiancée had to testify publicly about the years of abuse and manipulation. She had to relive every humiliating moment, every threat, every crime she was forced to commit. The entrepreneur was present in the room, watching as she broke down on the witness stand, exposing her deepest wounds to strangers who judged her with cold eyes. The girl, who had now spent 8 months under the entrepreneur's care, began to ask about the pretty lady again. The initial anger had turned into something more complex, a mixture of longing and confusion. The therapist suggested that a supervised meeting could help both of them process their feelings. The meeting took place in a public park on a Sunday afternoon. The ex-fiancée arrived nervous, wringing her hands, clearly expecting rejection. The girl ran towards her but stopped a few steps away, as if an invisible barrier prevented her from approaching completely. "You did bad things," the girl said, her voice small but firm. "The uncle said you hurt a lot of people. That because of you, Grandma didn't have money for medicine." The ex-fiancée knelt down, getting to the child's height. "It's true," she replied, her voice choked. "I did very bad things, but not because I wanted to. There was someone forcing me, making me. That doesn't make what I did right, but—" "Why did you come see me then?" the girl interrupted. "If you were so bad, why did you bring food?" The simple question carried the weight of months of emotional confusion. The ex-fiancée let the tears flow freely. "Because when I looked at you, I saw myself when I was little. I saw a child trapped in a situation she didn't choose, who desperately needed someone to believe she deserved better, and I needed to save at least one life when I couldn't save my own." The girl was silent for a long moment, processing the words with her limited but surprisingly deep understanding. Then, slowly, she took a step forward and hugged the woman. It was a hesitant hug, laden with pain and forgiveness at the same time. The entrepreneur watched the scene from afar, feeling something shift inside him. During all those months, he had tried to categorize everything in black and white, victims and villains, right and wrong. But life didn't work that way. People were complicated, carried pains that created cycles of suffering, and forgiveness was a process much more complex than he had ever imagined. In the following weeks, the three began to spend more time together. It wasn't a traditional or comfortable arrangement. There was tension, difficult moments, conversations that ended in tears. But there was also something starting to grow, a fragile connection based on brutal honesty and mutual understanding. The legal battle for the girl's custody reached its decisive moment when the judge responsible decided to hear from her directly. In the courtroom, before serious and imposing adults, the 4-year-old child was asked where she wanted to stay. "I want to stay with the uncle," she said with surprising clarity. "Because he never lied to me. He never abandoned me even when I was bad, and he makes me feel like I deserve to be loved even if I'm from the trash." The silence that followed was absolute. Some present in the room had tears in their eyes. The entrepreneur himself had to fight to maintain his composure. But the girl wasn't finished. "And I want the pretty lady to stay too," she added, looking at the ex-fiancé who was sitting in the back of the room. "Because she never really abandoned me either. She was just hurt, like me." The judge granted definitive custody to the entrepreneur that same day, impressed not only by the resources he could offer, but by the evident transformation that child had provoked in a man previously known for his emotional coldness. The lawsuit against the ex-fiancé's brother finally came to a conclusion 1 year after the interrupted wedding. With irrefutable evidence of years of fraud, manipulation, and threats, he was forced to compensate all the victims who could be identified. He lost everything he had built through dishonest means. His assets were confiscated, his connections abandoned him when he no longer had power to offer. The ex-fiancée testified for the last time, and when she stepped down from the stand, she looked directly at her brother. There was no more fear in her eyes, just a deep sadness for what he had become and for what he had destroyed. He tried to face her with his usual arrogance, but even he couldn't maintain the pose when confronted with the consequences of his actions. With the end of the lawsuit, she could finally breathe. The debts with loan sharks were paid off through the compensation, and for the first time in years, she could walk down the street without constantly looking over her shoulder. But freedom also brought uncertainty. What to do now? How to rebuild a life after so much destruction? It was the girl who, with her childish simplicity, offered the answer. During a simple dinner in the entrepreneur's apartment, she looked at the two adults and said, "Can we be a different family? Without the normal rules, but everyone taking care of everyone?" The entrepreneur and the ex-fiancée looked at each other, surprised. The proposal was unusual, contrary to all social conventions, but there was something fundamentally true in it. They weren't a traditional family. There was no forced romance or pretense of perfection. But there was something more valuable, a genuine commitment to care for each other, built on the ruins of everything that had been destroyed. "I think we can try," the entrepreneur replied finally, looking at the ex-fiancée. "If you want to." "I want to," she whispered, "but I don't know how to be part of a real family." "Nobody here does," he admitted with a sad smile. "We'll learn together." The following months weren't easy. Society judged the unconventional arrangement. Unkind comments circulated among the entrepreneur's social circles, and there were moments of doubt and relapse. The girl still had nightmares. The ex-fiancée still struggled with the guilt of her past, and the entrepreneur still needed to learn to balance emotional responsibilities with his career. But there were small victories that meant everything. The girl made her first real friend at school, a child who didn't care about her background. The ex-fiancée got a better job, using administrative skills that she had developed before being consumed by her brother's manipulation. The entrepreneur discovered that his greatest achievement wasn't in his accumulated fortune, but in the ability to love and be loved by people who knew him in his imperfect essence. On a quiet afternoon, almost 2 years after the interrupted wedding, the three were sitting in the small garden of the apartment they now shared. The girl drew birds in a new notebook. The ex-fiancée read aloud a children's story, and the entrepreneur simply watched, feeling a peace he had never experienced despite all the profits and dividends he had accumulated throughout his life. "Do you think Grandma would be happy?" the girl asked suddenly, her big eyes fixed on the two adults. "Yes," the ex-fiancée replied without hesitation. "She would be very proud to see the strong person you are becoming. And she would be happy to see that none of us are alone," the entrepreneur added, feeling a deep gratitude for that imperfect but genuine moment. The girl smiled, returning to her drawings. And in that smile, there was hope. Hope that cycles of pain could be broken, that broken people could heal together, and that families could be built not through blood or conventions, but through the daily choice to care, forgive, and love, despite all imperfections. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.